Folks, thanks for tuning in today, and you'll be glad again that you did, because we've got some items that you're not hearing about behind the scenes on some of the main headlines, some really incredible stuff that's going on in Canada, the US, and interesting developments over in Iran and what's happening there. Let's jump right into it. Thanks for tuning in and your comments. The Iranian situation actually is boiling up, not down. Iran has launched attacks, missile attacks on Kuwait and Bahrain, and the U.S. has had to intercept and did somewhat successfully intercept those missiles. But it's showing that the so-called ceasefire that looked at one point to be close may be ongoing and at risk. And that's affecting markets. I'll tell you about that in just a second. There's also a situation in the Congress in the U.S. where it's becoming very close in a vote to take away the so-called war-making or war-declaring powers that are vested by the Constitution into the hands of the president. That was came to a tie vote just recently, and it looks like another vote is maybe being prepared. That's going to have some effect. If it's passed, it would have some effect on the extent to which the president can continue the issues related to Iran and the attacks on Iran. So keep an eye on that development, and it shows why these why these congressional races that are taking place in the U.S. are so critically important. On the positive side for the U.S., another country has joined in saying they will help the U.S. in the war against Iran. Romania has come forward. Now, they don't have particularly an aggressive, what you would call a navy or an army, but they're saying their technologies will be made available to the U.S. in the war against Iran. As we see the effects of war and how both sides in media, and mainly mainstream media, which tends to be culturally Marxist, and also the TikTok and similar social media networks, which generally tend to be anti-US in terms of, or let's say anti-conservative US in terms of their audiences, which are millions and millions of Gen Z up to, let's say you want to make it 15-year-olds, 14-year-olds, up to about the 30-year-old crowd. And an interesting, sometimes stories, individual stories, they are anecdotal, as we say, but they can be pointing to a trend. And in a very interesting situation in a high school called, this is Flowood High School, Northwest High School in Flowood, Mississippi, of all places. A teacher there noticed that during the daily ritual, which happens in U.S. high schools, of the Pledge of Allegiance, many students, matter of fact, large numbers of students, were staying seated and were not standing up. And when the teacher was asking about this, why they're not standing for the oath of allegiance, the students who were asked, they said they didn't really know why they weren't standing up. They just didn't feel like taking the oath of allegiance. This particular teacher then started bringing books into the sessions of these discussion sessions, principally books that were written by Jack Carr. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's a New York Times bestseller. He's a former Navy SEAL and veteran, and he's written some books that talk about the various reasons why the U.S. intervenes in some of the more dangerous parts of the world. After the students had been given these books and had been given a project to read the books and also then talk about it, it was noticeably different. There's a noticeable difference in terms of the students then standing, this is after a few weeks, standing for the oath of allegiance after having these discussions. And the teachers who were involved are saying it was a noticeable impact of difference when students were moved away from their devices and from their machines and looking to things like book reading and discussion. So who knows if that's going to be a trend, but it's certainly, the anecdote certainly points to something that we can see the effect when you give both sides of a discussion. People can make decisions rather than just when one side is given. If you want to talk about conflict and the sports arena, the WNBA, that's of course the women's NBA, really is getting more and more viewers and good attendance, and apparently the guys are liking it more. And an incident just last night maybe shows why. Brittany Griner, if you remember a story in the news, this is a couple years ago, where this particular basketball player, she had been arrested when she was in Russia, of all places, and arrested for having certain drugs on her being. And she was actually in jail in Russia, and then a deal was made with the US, got her out. She's been playing in the WNBA, very, very aggressive. And one of her opponents is a woman by the name of Angel Reese, and it really erupted into an unprecedented battle on the basketball floor. And if you check out, you want to see the video if you're interested in women wrestling in women's basketball, Brittany Griner just picks up Angel Reese and just throws her to the floor. She got a penalty for that, of course, but showing that is that one of the reasons the women's NBA is getting more attention? We don't know. On something a little more serious in women's sports, at San Jose State University, a number of the students and some of the staff there are suing the university because the university is not following what they say they should be following in terms of the federal government directive of no biological men competing against women in women's sports. Things kind of erupted. You remember the incident, you may have remembered the incident where the transgendered volleyball player, the biological male, spiked the ball so hard into the face of one of the girls on the opposite side of the net that he broke her nose. Another girl was raising a complaint that the person she was assigned to roommate with was actually a biological male. And when they were raising these issues, when the female students and players were raising these image with the staff and some of the administration at San Jose State University, they were threatened. They were told if they spoke up on these issues, they would lose their scholarship. They might have to be forced to go and take therapy lessons because they didn't want to have biological males competing against them. And it's on record that some of them were even told by the administration they would have to leave university. So the battle really, even though this is what we call an 80-20 issue, where the vast majority of people actually support the separation of men and women in sports and don't want to see transgendered males competing against women, still the universities themselves and the administrations are holding a pretty tight hold, having these young women gripped in the fear of speaking up. We'll see where that goes, but it might be one of the reasons this type of approach of heavy-handed universities not following the directives and the wishes of parents and students. There's a Gallup poll that's just out that shows on the issue of gender transition, there's been quite a shift. In 2021, 46% of people interviewed were supportive of the whole transition issue and people transitioning. And that's dropped just in 4 years. That's dropped to 38%. So a significant drop there, probably related to the heavy-handed way in which some of these universities are handling the issue. 57% of people, this is Gallup poll in the US, saying it's actually, they think the issue of transitioning is morally wrong. So we'll see where if this movement in lack of dropping support on the transgender issues continues. Well, as we have predicted, keep an eye on the governor's race. It's going to be, in fact, it will be a runoff between the Democratic selection. That's Tom Steyer. He is a multi-gazillionaire. I don't have any problem with that. And it seems like Democrats don't have a problem with multimillionaires as long as they are Democrats. And Steve Hilton, it looks like they will be facing off now in the final. And on that race with Karen Bass, remember we've been talking about that, and I use some of these incidents in the US to look at trends that are happening in other places in the world, even in Canada. But Karen Bass, who's been the radically left mayor of Los Angeles, remember we've been talking about her, and she's been challenged by Spencer Pratt, who's kind of middle of the road, maybe slightly conservative leading. He says he's getting the moms' votes because he's going after things like crime. So that race was, the votes took place yesterday, and there will indeed, as I predicted, there will now be a runoff the top two candidates. It surprised many people that Spencer Pratt was able to get in second place among all of them, and now the top two, that's Karen Bass and Spencer Pratt, will be running off in a final. I'm going to make a prediction here. As much as I think it would be good for Los Angeles and for cities like Los Angeles to have common sense, small c conservative mayors, one of the people, the person who came third in that race, was also left-leaning, as was Karen Bass. She's now off the ticket because she came third, and you only take the top two. My guess is that most of her votes, this is the woman who was in third place and is now off the ticket, but was a leftist, socialist-leaning woman. Most of her votes, I think, will go in the final analysis to Karen Bass. It's, I think, an uphill race for Spencer Pratt at this point, but let's see what happens if he's able to overcome it. And on a similar note, remember, I've been framing these two things for you. One on the West Coast, that's the Los Angeles election, and the election in Maine, where a Senate seat could be up for grabs. And remember this Graham Plattner, he's the guy, he's the choice of the Democrats there, and more stuff comes out about him. The Nazi tattoo that he's had to try and cover up, the incredibly, some of the most vile and pornographic texts that you could imagine. More and more keep coming out that he was involved in up until fairly recently. All kinds of horrendous stuff, the way he laughed at videos of U.S. soldiers being shot in action. And Democrats were continuing to support him, but he was summoned to Washington to have lunch with senior Democrats. And they apparently, in a closed meeting, they said, "Is there any more stuff coming out, Graham?" And he's again saying, no, it's all out there, even the bad stuff that I used to like to do when I was sitting in porta potties, and all the just outrageous stuff he's been involved in. And Democrats who used to be opposed to this kind of thing are sticking with their man. It looks like he survived the lunch, and watch that race continue to unfold, see if he gets elected. The show, many people around the world, including Canadians, watch the show called 60 Minutes. It's been on for decades, very famous 1-hour show. And the head of that, Scott Pelley, if you see him on the news, you'll recognize his face. He has just quit because he's been in a battle lately with the owner. The owner is called, you'll hear the name David Ellison. That's who owns the actual network, and he's the head of Paramount. And remember, he brought on Barry Weiss. She's was a reporter who tended to be too, let's call it small c conservative in her thinking, and she got bounced, very well known, but got bounced from major publications that she worked at. She's now a major player in the network there. And she says she tried to talk Steve Pelley into staying, but he has quit. And they say that's going to create problems. The reason he quit, he says, they're not being tough enough on Trump, is basically what it comes down to. And CBS saying, no, they just want a more balanced picture of the news. We'll see if the 60-minute show, which has been hugely popular for decades, will be able to continue on. But another shift that we're seeing that's interesting, at a concert, a very recent rock concert in Tampa, Florida, some of you folks who are sort of in my generation might not have heard of a group called the Black Crowes. Their lead singer is Chris Robinson, and he had some of his band coming out dressed up in Uncle Sam or U.S. costumes, making a mockery of the U.S. at this rock concert. And of all things, people at the rock concert started booing, and many of them walked out. And so interesting there to see the support. You might hear some sirens right behind me. I am broadcasting from Vancouver, British Columbia. I've said before, Vancouver, if you ever visit here, it's a beautiful city, wonderful to visit. It is the most siren-oriented city, I say this quite literally, in the world. This is my little free addition to the podcast today. I will vote for the mayor, the person running for mayor of Vancouver, who says they'll do something about 24/7 sirens. You see fire trucks and police cars slowly going up and down the street. at all times of day or night, and even not in a rush, and then stopping and turning off their siren. So quick little free addition there from Siren City, Vancouver. Domino's Pizza is going to be jumping onto the protein trend, and they say it's not fully disclosed, but you can expect the CEO announcing they have figured out a way to add more protein to your pizza and more chicken, and hey, ready for this? More bacon. So the vegetarian movement, or the vegan movement, I'm not saying is dead, but the shift is very clear. People are realizing you do need more protein. The CEO of Coca-Cola has announced they are figuring out ways to add more protein and fiber to Coca-Cola. I'll wait to drink on that one. We'll see what happens there. But clearly moving, and Starbucks protein lattes have really caught on. So protein is where it's all about, folks. In Iowa, remember yesterday, if those our regular listeners and viewers, I was talking about a runoff there, a primary. This is where a party decides who's going to represent them in the larger race. And the primary there, the Republican primary between, this is for governor, Randy Feenstra and Zach Lon, was getting a lot of attention. And one of the reasons it was because President Trump has had a pretty good record over the last month. Any of these candidates that he comes out supporting, they almost all win. And in this case, he was the guy running against Trump's hoped for guy, is Randy Feenstra, is a gentleman by the name of Zach Lon, and he was being supported by Turning Point USA. That was, of course, the late Charlie Clerk, his organization. So it's interesting because Turning Point USA has usually supported a Trump candidate. In this case, and Trump was, pretty closely aligned. He liked Charlie Kirk with TPUSA. And guess what? It was the TPUSA, it was the Turning Point USA candidate, or who had the support from them, that won and beat Trump's guy. We'll see how that person does when it goes now to the full state in the race for governor. The jobs report was very encouraging to the U.S. government. On the U.S. side, 122,000 increase in private sector jobs. So that exceeded what the media and others were predicting. They were predicting somewhere maybe just south of 100,000. And the Bank of America also coming out with an announcement that they're hiring 4,000 new interns from 500 different colleges. So we're seeing, luckily or thankfully, I guess, for the Trump administration, they're pleased with the numbers showing the economy strong and resilient in the U.S. Well, you and I grew up, and most people grow up thinking nicotine is not a good thing. So because medical studies are showing that nicotine associated with tobacco is what was causing all the cancer, I'm just telling you what the mainstream testing and medical supports are saying. And so we've seen a revival in nicotine pouches. These are called free, FRE, that's the name of the pouch. Nicotine pouches, you saw it first in the UFC, in the mixed martial arts athletes using these, NASCAR athletes using nicotine pouches, they say, for alertness and other areas. So nicotine on a rebound, up in form, if it's in form of a pouch and not associated with smoke. Well, one area that's not up for a number of states is the area of taxes, where in the states now, reports continue to show, Mississippi, for instance, Tennessee, South Carolina, Arizona, which now has a flat tax, that something that I introduced when I was Minister of Finance in Alberta. States increasingly that have lower taxes are drawing people from other states. The migration is very clear. We'll see if that sinks into the more liberal states and provinces or not. A caution coming out from oil companies like Chevron, even though, and as I've been reporting, the price of oil has been staying below 100 recently. WTI oil and the Brent oil has been staying below 100, but oil CEOs are saying that their reserves, the massive reserves, are being drawn down quite low because the U.S. now is exporting much more oil to Europe, for instance. And they're saying unless things take a bit of a turnaround there in Iran, we will see this lower price, slightly lower, of $100 start to move up. So maybe watch things there for the summer driving. We'll see where that goes. Another indication that the markets are not liking the fact that Iran is not being settled. Price of gold going up, That always happens when there are uncertain times. Remember, I've been talking about how bonds, the bond market, that's the borrowing markets, people who were buying bonds were doing quite well. And now there's some slight movement away from bonds back to gold. Gen Z is, we've talked about this before, but stats just coming out yesterday showing let's say, warmth from Gen Z towards socialism in general, and not just socialism, but there's Ed Luce, a commentator over at Financial Times, in his column today, very interesting, a third now of Gen Z now saying they actually favor consideration of communism, actually favor it. 1/3 of Gen Z, 2/3 of Gen Z saying they have a very favorable attitude towards socialism, which is probably the reason that candidates and representatives like Mayor Mondami in New York and even this Graham Plattner in Maine, as long as they're promising that they're going to give you lots, everything will be free. The more free stuff they promise, it seems like the higher votes they get from Gen Z. There's AP News has some remarkable video coverage about some things that are going on. And they're talking about again, I talked about this a little earlier, the support for same-sex marriage has dropped, interestingly enough. Nobody's asking for legislation against it, but support for that in 4 years, generally, it's still majority support in the population, 65%, but that's a drop from 71% in just 4 years. And it seems to me any group that tries to get militant, that tries to force their reality on others, they actually will lose public support generally. Well, Mayor Mondami should be keeping his eyes open in the Brooklyn area and the Queens area in New York, because disturbing footage coming out more and more of people who are late at night and early in the morning crawling into and out of the sewer system through the manhole systems, and the video recordings of that is disturbing. It appears there are growing numbers of people living down in the sewer system. You think this is coming from some kind of a sci-fi movie, but it's a fact, and Mayor Mondami says he's going to look into that. He's supposedly making life better for people, but more and more heading to the sewers. So let's see where, in fact, that is all going to go. In Canada, there was good news, as I talked about yesterday, with tariffs on things like aluminum and copper going down, but President Trump has just announced that over 60 countries are going to be hit with a 10% tax. Countries that are deemed to be allowing manufactured goods to be coming in from nations that have forced labor, notably China, but other nations do also. And Canada is on the list that's been identified by the U.S. as allowing the sale of products coming in from countries that have forced labor. That's just new, just hitting Canada now, and we'll see what happens there. Prime Minister Carney is under increased pressure from the opposition leader Pierre Poilievre in terms of saying he's not doing making availability in news conferences like he used to. And Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, is saying it's because of the reports that have come out that Canada is now officially in a recession, and saying that the Prime Minister doesn't want to face that. I'm going to make it a little prediction here on another leader in Canada. This gentleman's name is Wab Kinew. He's actually the Premier of the province of Manitoba. He's a socialist, NDP, but he is really going up in the polls and popularity, not just in his province, but across the country. And two areas, he's really attacking the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, trying to almost accuse her of not being tough enough against the separatist movement in Alberta. That is a movement which it comes to a vote. I do believe the separatists will not win 50% of the vote. That's my prediction. But he's going after her really hard, and also going after big tech really hard, as most socialists do. I'm making a prediction. Don't think that Wab Kinew is done in terms of being Premier of Manitoba. I think he has other goals in mind. The fact that he's First Nations, the fact that he's got that long ponytail, he's really getting a lot of support from Gen Z and on these issues. So keep an eye on Wab Kinew. That's a prediction. You may have heard it here first. and we'll see where that goes. Prime Minister Carney getting flack today because he's just appointed a faith advisory council. Listen, anytime you have any government appointing a council to advise on faith makes me a little bit nervous. Sort of interesting that the Liberals are always saying that there should be a wall of separation between faith and government, and here they're appointing their own advisory council. A couple names on there that I recognize that are actually seem to be fairly common sense individuals, but getting flack, the Prime Minister getting flack, one of those people, Omar Al-Ghabra. I was in the House of Commons at the same time as Mr. Al-Ghabra, very, very anti-Semitic, and even wanted to keep Hezbollah as be recognized not as a terrorist group. That's Hezbollah, remember, is the terrorist group in Lebanon that is financed by the Muslim extremists in Iran. So he's not seen very favorably at all. And in Edmonton, there's individual Avnish Nanda has come out in the past very anti-Israel, also on that council. And so the Faith Council, people seem to be losing faith in the Faith Council from the day it got announced. I'd like to keep you advised of some of the things that are going on in the Gen Z world. Interesting column. This one's in the Wall Street Journal about lunch shaming. And we know that kids get bullied on all kinds of things, but it seems increasingly kids at school they'll take a snap with their phone of a person just as they're biting into a sandwich, and then they put it on the social network, and kids are getting embarrassed and shamed. Some kids talk about they're looking for quiet little corners to eat their lunch in, and what teachers have done to go against that is in some of these schools, they're banning the use of phones all day long, and they say there's been a corresponding return to the lunchrooms when kids are not fearing what they're going to be eating. So moms and maybe dads, if you're packing those lunches, encourage your kids, eat the lunch, back away from the lunch shaming that's going on. Talking about backing away, in France, the legislators there have dropped their attempt. They were looking at putting up a law that would, in certain circumstances, require priests in confessions to tell what the sinners were confessing to. And they said the government in France said they were trying to do this to curb criminality and find out where the criminals are, if the criminals are confessing to the priest. This, of course, would have been huge, over 2,000 years of confessionals to the priests. It's central to the Catholic Church. There's enough opposition there that they have backed off of doing that. One commentator saying, who was not, in fact, a Catholic, saying, well, just reminding people, we do have actually a high priest, Jesus Christ. We can take our confessions direct to him, and there's no agency, we don't think, on earth that can force Jesus Christ to go the way that the French government wants to go. So interesting what's happening. Folks, thanks for your input on these issues. Stay tuned. We'll talk to you tomorrow.